this incredible bridging of faunal and fantastical worlds, but thinking about the stories that we tell through geographies, through time. And that's what struck me, but we're not here to listen to me. We're here to actually listen about the various tensions of storytelling, is what we decide to call this conversation, and do so through the lens of not only Reena, who's with us here tonight, but also that of Dr. Cleo Roberts, who is a wonderful writer, curator, and someone who I've collaborated with in the past and have deep respect for. She focuses on South and Southeast Asian contemporary art, so it could not be more apt. Anyway, I defer over to them to introduce themselves, but we'll also be sharing with you some slides and taking you through all the various angles to Reena's wonderful work. So anyway, thank you so much, Reena and Cleo, for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here and also to talk about Reena's work, which I've followed for many years, because it does something that I think is particularly important when you think about tensions and storytelling, that it has many layers and primarily masks those tensions. I think the initial interaction with the work is one of beauty and intrigue, and then you get to these levels of tension. And I thought it would be worth, when we were discussing this, we're going to focus today around works which are really focused on the tension, but also involve rivers, which have been a sort of re-emerging theme in Reena's work. And this piece we're seeing here is 2 Degrees, and it came out of a project in Sydney called the River Project. And Reena, I was going to ask you to start off by talking about that project and what we're seeing here.
Thank you, Cleo. I think, there's so many different threads in the work that we could have drawn from, and I think the fact that you've chosen to stay around rivers is also quite relevant at this point, because it's also, I'm opening an exhibition that takes these ideas ahead, which just opens on the 7th. And this work was in a sense a genesis for the work that I'm making now. And while much of the early work is about the sort of confluence and conflict, the sort of tensions between communities. If I might just go back a little bit, just to give you a sense of why some of those themes are, of such importance in the work, is because, growing up in a city like Mumbai, then Bombay, one was, one always felt that you were in an environment that's so inclusive, that you grew up in suburban Bombay, which was really rich with people from various different religious backgrounds, and it almost felt a sense of like the whole, every possible religion of the world is around you. And this experience of growing up in a city like that, and with an immense sense of pride, at some point you began to sort of put these ideas into question when one's own experience of living in the city had changed. And I'm referring now to, say, the 92 riots or the 2002 riots in Mumbai that we experienced firsthand. And I sort of was, drawn to going back to my early childhood years, where I grew up listening to stories. Talking of stories. And my father, while taking walks on the terrace, would often tell us about his early childhood years in Lahore, which is now in Pakistan, and which was, of course, part of India, pre-partition. And at that point, there's of course an enormous sense of silence around partition. Most families who witnessed it wanted to bury the past behind, and which is why it's something that you don't really read enough of in history books even. And I mean, the way these stories are handed down, I think 70 years post this most traumatic, the world's largest human migration in human history, there isn't enough written about it or spoken about it. And I feel like time's really running out, because most of those who were part of that generation are already, moving on. And yeah, so I mean, there's been this sort of recurring theme within the work where I think of these communities and the fishers and these, but for the river biennial, I was thinking about the river Indus and its multiple tributaries where Ravi Beach, Satluj flow into India, and Jhelum, Chenab, and the river Indus into Pakistan. And essentially, I mean, in the 60s, the partitioning of the waters took place where where you have these long shared civilizational histories. And this piece, of course, alludes to the terracottas of the Indus Valley civilization, and yet the sort of split in the urns that actually carries a sound component where it's essentially sounds of the river collected at various points where, the river has multiple names, but essentially the waters being the same. And that is something that I was sort of, alluding to.
If we look, Jen, can we flick through and there's a map of that's perfect. That sort of really gives a visual on the magnitude of the river and its various sources, and especially the areas that it runs through, which are to this day incredibly contentious. Like Kashmir is, as we speak, still sort of under massive tension, having Modi sort of revoked an article and sort of seized it almost. But can we talk about the way that also there was a treaty over this conflict and how you might sort of share water?
Well, I mean, as we know, most rivers, I mean, get manipulated through either dam projects or hydroelectric projects, and often the course of the river, I mean, in this case, it's not the boundaries, but while rivers have been the bed of civilizations, they've also sort of often been boundaries between countries. And here, of course, the source of the river is in India, and which is why there's always this sort of conflict over, and we know, I mean, water wars would be waged over time, and this often this crunch for natural resources. So at the heart of these lie the problems of natural resources, whether it's land. And I often make these analogies between land, body, rivers, and veins. And I mean, this river, as you see, runs through, like I said, Jhelum, Chenab, and the river Indus go into India, and Ravi Beach, Satluj.
And I also know, I can't profess to know huge amounts about the mythologies that revolve around this river. I know more about the sort of Ganges and the way that it's named. It has hundreds of different names. Is this something that you also find interesting within the work, like the mythological dimensions of water?
Well, I mean, I'm mostly thinking about our own relationship to water as not only are our bodies composed of water essentially, but also the fact that water remains the origin of all life, and this sort of circle of life of what we carry within us internally, and our relationship to rivers as something that and communities that live around these rivers. But I think from that, the work that you saw was that the two trees that were drawn in henna bifurcate, sort of again alluding to these long shared civilizational histories where they're sort of deeply rooted, and yet they sort of where one half grows into the banyan tree and the other into the deodar tree as these national trees of India and Pakistan. And I think many of the other works that follow really are these are hybrids that are formed by one half coming from each side of the border. So this sort of this need to try and bring things together, this kind of tensions of coexistence vis-a-vis conflict, and when one is thinking of not just this sort of political divide, but I mean, nature knows no boundaries. I mean, you essentially have rivers and mountains that form sort of bound in the natural environment, and often these species are so native to a particular land, whereas both try to claim ownership to natural forms that don't essentially belong to either. And I think for me it was also this sort of leap of moving away, of distancing ourselves not just as a human species, but one that really cohabits this planet, where we know largely the disappearance of one results in the disappearance of another. And I mean, today, in this moment, we understand our sort of interdependence better than ever before. I mean, we're seeing the impact of what happens in one part of the world instantly affecting every other part of the world. And
Sorry, I was going to say, can we go to the next image, which just when you talk about cyclical and things being connected, this sort of bit further on, the Tondo work, Cleft, which is in the show at the moment in AORA, this work, I was going to ask you exactly this idea of the circular form. Are you alluding here to this interconnection?
Yeah, it's almost like this sort of a globe that's formed with, as I was trying to say, each of these species that you see are actually one halves coming from each side of borders of countries, either in conflict or partition. So whether it's Ireland and UK having the Dion, the deer, and the lion forming a cross between the two, or the Markhor and the tiger from India and Pakistan. And essentially all national symbols were meant to unite people from a region or a geography, and they often become points of conflict and contestation, like I said, when we're trying to claim ownership to these natural forms. And here you have, every tree, bird that you see are conjoined. So you have, like, from US and Cuba, you have the oak palm, the oak tree and the palm tree coming together. Or you have the crested caracara and the eagle from US and Mexico forming a new hybrid, so to speak. So Cleft really was sort of, in a sense, on the one hand, you have this sort of wires that are barbed wires that I essentially work with electric cables that are meant to be transmitters of energy exchange, as communication cables, and yet here they sort of seem to morph into barbed wires or fences in the other cases, holding these kind of inherent contradictions of being both a conduit carrier and a barrier at the same time.
And do you find that with the animals, if we can get a detail shot, so you can sort of see the bodies more closely, I appreciate that it's a hybrid, but is there a way that we can also see this as highlighting the difference between animals?
I mean, I in some cases, I sort of bring them together more seamlessly, whereas in others, I sort of try to hold the violence in the image itself of this division, as well as, they sort of coming together. And
so I'm just thinking,
really referring to these sort of zoological, botanical drawings, to sort of form a bridge between the human and natural worlds.
Because also the way that you've displayed them often takes from a very loaded way, like museological form of display, which is totally loaded, and particularly in India, with this idea of colonialism and sort of wanting to study your subjects, and as a way of forming a body of knowledge, which, if you read Foucault, knowledge is power. Is there something that we're drawing on in this sort of species type drawings as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm also thinking of, in a sense, sort of museumizing them to either suggest a kind of species that perhaps existed in the past, or a kind of proposition for an imagined future where they may come together. And like I said, they would show us how to cohabit this planet. When it's a moment to turn to another species other than the human race.
And the text on here, is this your sort of story writing, your narrative playing out?
Well, I mean, I do draw from, there is, of course, the element of the fictional that I really deeply enjoy. I mean, speaking of, again, storytelling, I think no two stories are the same. I mean, it's really the teller who weaves their own perceptions, their own ideas, views, interpretations of things. And I mean, that's something that I've really been preoccupied with through a lot of my practice. And especially here, like you said, I mean, the whole act of documenting, archiving, this production of knowledge that was so integral to the colonial practice of studying species from the lands that they visited. So it is culling imagery out of existing and archives that I have been going to, but forming their own sort of world of an imagined species, of fantastical species that might perhaps come together.
And also in that vein, and this is something that I kind of wanted to expand on a bit, is that there were also many species introduced to India at that time, which have caused a huge number of problems. Like, they've become deeply invasive species, which have killed a lot of the natural habitat. You see it around Bangalore, around the lines. I know your leaking lines work looked at various lines that were drawn up. Could you say something about that as well, when nature isn't benign, which I think we sometimes forget that it isn't?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you do see the erasure of a lot of species because of the sort of disturbance in the ecological sort of, I mean, these are native to that particular land, and certainly injecting something that's extraneous or foreign can affect the ecological balance there. And as you rightly point out, but I think, I mean, for me as an artist, the line is such an essential part of an artist's toolkit, and when drawn across territory, has such huge implications for people on either side. And often when I think of these lines or these divisions, it's not so much the physical border as much as the sort of social and psychological barriers that exist between people, between communities. And I think also, as we go along, I'd probably speak of other works where I often think of these overlaps also between ecology and cultures, where they come together, and these liminal spaces, or spaces that are shared and rich in biodiversity, are also often spaces that I'm trying to think of, where communities come together and have a cultural experience that is rich.
Can we look at the amazing chorus work, which I think if there were if created, that's the one. If there were an image for storytelling and receiving stories, I think this could possibly be it, because we're seeing someone in the middle. And can you tell us a bit about how this installation, it's sort of part of a series?
Yeah, I mean, this was actually, at a time when I was really going through a lot of war zones and sort of, I don't know how familiar with the Leaking Line series that actually had not just beginning with my own experience of the Radcliffe line that was, drawn between a little village that the Wagah-Atari border, which actually runs through a little village, and what it did in terms of tearing apart a nation into two. And when I think of lines drawn elsewhere, when I began seeing the Durand line between, say, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or say you have several other lines, the blue line, the green line, and so on. And while looking at a lot of these zones, I was thinking of these pre-radar acoustic devices that were built during the World Wars. And it was really to track sounds of enemy aircrafts. And I decided to subvert those notions of war by having sounds of birds in communication across borders. So you have, like, say, the cuckoo bird from Israel singing to the Palestinian sunbird, or you have again the crested caracara from Mexico calling out to the eagle from the US, or peacock with the chukar, or the peacar. So all of these are again coined names, but I have a whole range of, and the sounds that I began to source from the Manchester Museum archives that helped me source these sounds. So it was also to try and tune into signals from the natural world that we're often not being attentive enough. It's almost like if we were to listen to nature, and
yeah.
And also, when you think about archives, and I was thinking about you doing your archival work, that is something that there's such a paucity of, is sound recording. Like, sound archives are a real rarity, and it's only sort of, maybe since sound was easily recordable that you have it, but you don't have it in the same way that you have this paper trail, the bureaucratic paper trail, which you pointed on. Like, does that not miss the psychological and all the things you're really filling in for us?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the bureaucratical, and we spoke about that. I mean, there was nearly a decade and a half of work that I made using the rubber stamp, which is, of course, such a metaphor of the bureaucracy. And anyone who knows India would know that almost nothing can either come in or leave without that rubber stamp that is so sort of deeply entrenched in bureaucracy. And I think that was something that is also a very seminal part of my work, where I draw out of official records, whether they were names of people who've gone missing in various regions, or out of official police records, or monuments that have either disappeared, or due to pulls and pressures of rapid urbanization, builder lobby, land grabbing, efforts at conservation, preservation have been lost. So a lot of those people who are on the margins, or people who are who don't have the official status as citizens, and those identities that are not recognized or stamped and endorsed by the state are sort of fall within those crevices and cracks, which is something that runs again through a lot of the work. And how does one bring forth these stories that are often silent or are unseen?
And if we think about, we're going to see, Jen, thank you so much. A few other, you knew exactly where I was going. You see a few other sort of these, they're just totally wonderful, these works. And when things are back to normal, they should be coming to London and elsewhere. Are these works and your practice at large, is it very much embedded in India and South Asia, or do you think you'd be making similar work if you were elsewhere?
I mean, certainly the place you live and work shapes the way you think, and I wouldn't say that my practice would be the same. Certainly not. I mean, I think the impulses, the motivations, what drives you as an artist is so deeply rooted in, at least I can speak for myself, that it's so deeply rooted from in my own experience of uh, not just my growing up years in India, and while I might take that vantage point outside of India, and of course the work really then expands into um, the universal, you know, what is so personal can also be the more universal. And I've seen that through my practice, where a piece that is so deeply personal was received across the world with, I think, that resonance that it carried, which I really never imagined. And I made it with a lot of hesitation. This is a work I made in 2007, which had to do with my own relationship with my mother, who I lost very early as a little girl. And I grew up with all the things she left behind, amongst which were her saris, and that remained stacked for nearly 30 years. But I brought them out at some point, and I decided to make translations from her handwritten recipe books into Braille. I sort of, wanted the viewer to face the kind of inaccessibility to the text, much like my own relationship with her. And I often think of language as being something that is so limiting when it comes to expressing or communicating deep notions of loss.
Yeah.
And so
it also links with the work that's just been opened in Paris, which you've also used Braille in this work.
That's right.
So it's such a beautiful work, and it's a number of constitutions from different countries, but do you want to sort of tell us which bits are in Braille?
So, I mean, these are, I'm glad you brought this up, because the work that I was talking about was really a decade before this work. And some of these, like I said, the ideas remain the same. They sort of transform. And I mean, in this case, it's called verso recto, recto verso. And you have constitutions, again, beginning with in the Indian and the Pakistani constitution. So I began looking at this document way back in 2002, 2003, when there was what we are experiencing globally today was what we were seeing in the city of Mumbai, where a lot of migrants who were coming in were being excluded, and there was this sort of resistance towards outsiders, and some of the same anxieties you see globally today. And I started revisiting this sort of promise of democracy and what were the values that it stood for, and decided to work with the constitutions. But in this case, it sort of really expands not just India, Pakistan, but it has US, Cuba, Serbia, Croatia, Sudan, South Sudan, North and South Korea. There's China and Japan and so on. So essentially what you see are the constitutions made in the dotted form, but where all the common shared values of, say, liberty, equality, justice are in Braille. It's almost a sort of metaphor of having lost sight of our shared and common aspirations, our common dreams and values that are so,
And as with the double bind being that as an artwork, the Braille is, you can't touch it. So that's also like does not communicate to anyone. It's totally redundant.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, with the Bandhani, you can neither feel it nor can the sighted view it, nor can those who are not sighted. So it's this kind of the illegibility is also about these sort of half-truths and our own limitations or perceptual limitations in the way we view the world. I think while we are free to make certain choices, I think there's no escaping the fact that we're all, we have our preconceived notions. And I think the work is also a reflection on our own our own limitations of understanding other perspectives and other views, and holding on to our side of the story, and the sort of space in between, the separation of the two scrolls. It also kind of alludes to these rivers, and again, the sort of this. I made this with crafts people who work in Kutch in Gujarat, and what's also interesting is that this is a dying craft, which almost only exists between Kutch and Karachi, both border sharing places between India and Pakistan, and that sort of adds another layer of meaning to the work.
Reena, would you say, and at a time we talked earlier, like where politics is seemingly thriving on terms of difference, would you say, and especially so in India, where enormous pressure is being put on Muslim communities and also the arts community in terms of what censorship and what you can't say, would you say you're an optimist?
I'd like to think that each of us have the capacity to make a difference, and that we can bring about change if we were to collectively work towards, making the change happen. And I think art is definitely a great vehicle, whether it has its own reach, perhaps a not very wide reach, but I think, films, or there's so many other forms of art that reach out to a whole range of people. And I certainly am one who believes that that it is incumbent upon us to really think of, through our work, the social, political change that we can bring about, and to question our own realities.
Yeah.
It's no, I think about it in terms of the environment that you're operating in as well, which I know many this year, many photographers have sort of been very heavily censored. Do you worry about it in terms of the art community? Because I think artists feel that they're not as scrutinized.
It's true. I mean, we're sort of still under the radar, but I think as a community, there is a collective strength, and there is a lot more conversation between us. But I think, unfortunately, we all live in our own echo chambers. Often we carry our own confirmation biases. We're all holding on to, like I said, our own partial truths. But what is really needed is this sort of fluidity of being able to move between both sides and being able to appreciate both perspectives. And I think what's happening is that we are, as a society, getting more and more polarized, and you see democracies all over the world are under strain. And so I think there is a need more than ever before to be able to be more fluid and more sort of open-minded as far as being able to absorb and accept other perspectives. And I think much of those gaps between what is said, I mean, when I think of, again, when we speak of stories and you think of memory and memory of the past, and what do we carry? I mean, memory is such a complex set of interactions between seeing, remembering, imagining, some shaped by language, some by imagery, and often much of our sort of the things that we disagree are about what happened in the past that is being replayed. And I think that is something that we, whether we're trying to take recourse to history, or we don't seem to be learning from the mistakes of the past. I mean, we keep going back to making the same mistakes over and over again. But yeah, here again with this sort of invisible hand that is at play, sort of trying to rearrange the natural world, through shifting ecotones. And like I was
Yeah.
saying, ecotones is really that space between two biomes, which is really, and this is from the River Nile, or even drawings that I was making of the River Nile, and one was of the Teesta River between Bangladesh, or the Colorado River.
And these, so just to explain to everyone, these are rivers which are sources of conflict. Again, we see these sort of water bodies being sort of an area of dispute.
That's right.
And honed in on as the place, and understandably so, because they are such a invaluable resource. But tell us a bit more about these works, and in particular the drawings, where you've sort of rearranged them almost like one of those puzzle cubes that you would get, where all the tiles you rearrange. Can you talk to us a bit about that aesthetic that you've adopted?
I often think of the unit in the whole, of the sort of missing fragment, and how, like I said, of how we sort of, the sort of gaps in transmission between what is said and how it gets interpreted. And here, literally, you have a missing fragment, or even through, like I said, the metaphor of blindness, of having lost sight, or other works like Blind Spots, where it is a physiological blind spot of what the eye is viewing at a time, and this sort of vision that it cannot, and you sort of have to complete the gaps through your own interpretation. And I play with that. It's a visual play with this sort of missing component that we all seem to be carrying with us. And
can you just find, before we open to questions, is the text, you often do this with your work, and it's something that I really enjoy because I adore reading, particularly, but the text, you often give us a snippet of text, but it's also often obscured.
That's interesting. Actually, when I started writing, I just felt that it became like an information panel, and I didn't really mean it to be that. And it's also, again, about what do these histories that, again, sort of reviewing the factual and the fictional, and to me it was almost like it was also irrelevant in a way, that what belongs to which side. I mean, it really doesn't belong to either. I mean, rivers are free to flow, disrespecting artificial man-made boundaries, or divisions. And so, I mean, I think for me it was also like trying to efface that, the sort of fixed, the sort of thinking of porosity of borders. And I decided to strike out the text, where it's there and yet it's sort of negated or not essential, and something that you can go against, because here are two countries battling over natural resources, or the natural forms that don't belong to them. So I kind of negate that. But in these works, it's really where I started to extract the line of each of these. So what you see here are actually like the borders between, say, US and Mexico, where the Colorado River dispute, or the River Imjin between North and South Korea, or the Shat al-Arab between Iraq and Iran, and Sudan, South Sudan with the Nile. So each of these lines were then brought into play in the later work that you see, which actually, this is a preview.
Yeah, I was going to say, no one, I know these are, I was going to say, these are like, this is sort of hot off the studio desk or floor, or I don't know where you make your work, but that they're going to be shown on Saturday for Nature Mort, their show, and they're so beautiful. And I think actually what's great about them for the online platform is that you still get the sense of the materials that you've knitted through the paper. And again, it's electrical wires, isn't it, that you're working with?
That's right, yes. I mean, I think it's this idea of how these sort of divisions come together and dissolve in a sense, you know. I mean, it's still so new, the work to me. I'm trying to make sense of it, but it's just sort of recomposing or reorganizing and reordering these lines to form a kind of landscape in a sense of, so all of these, like I said, these lines of division kind of dissolve to form, open up a new, this sort of fluidity of the river.
And I presume actually these lines, I mean, these rivers change as well, don't they? Like this will be irrelevant. I mean, these won't be the exact river that we see in 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. I mean, these are river drawings, and then there's another body of work which I would urge you all to see as that is released. It's the new exhibition is called Deep Rivers Run Quiet.
That's so beautiful.
And again, it has to do with these sort of, I think, of these long histories that are so much more deeply rooted, and that all of these sort of surfacial tensions and ripples and disturbances are kind of irrelevant in a sense.
Yeah. I wonder, first of all, start by just saying thank you to both of you so much, and for everyone to bearing with me while I go through the slides. It's usually it's been a real journey if we're speaking about journeys and going through a flow of things, discovering your work in this oscillatory manner, which leads us all the way over here. I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things that really resonated while I took a step back and learned so much from the both of you. But there was one thing that really resonated with me, Reena, where you're talking about communication and how sometimes words don't express everything. Actually, very often they do not express everything. And that is precisely the premise of this current show, where if you actually even look scientifically at the role words play in communication, it adds up to 7 to 10% of what we actually mean. The rest is tone, gesture, form, context, and that is where the power of image comes in the telling of stories. And beyond that, in communicating between people and peoples. And running off that, we were briefly going on this tangent, which would have been such an interesting conversation in itself, but it was, the value of art and artists and in the communication around the world. And for me, as a curator, I've always said that art is one of the most empathetic yet critical mediums by which you can communicate about topics. And here you're touching on some pretty important and heavy-hitting topics. The dispute between different countries, the tensions between humans and nature, humans and animals, and shooting a question back to you, I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit on memory and the memories that you want maybe each of us to have when we're looking at your work, or if it's really just up to us to develop our own memories, right? And in a sense, develop our own stories when we look at your work. Like, for example, you look at these river drawings and I won't necessarily get that it's a river, but it might spark this idea of flow with regards to something else. So I guess long story short, the role of memory in your work and how we each approach it?
I think that's a key question. I mean, I think as an artist, I really enjoy the fact that, you know, when you make work, it's not about imposing the artist's intention, I think, is one aspect of it. I mean, I often think of myself purely as a catalyst, because I think that so much around us sort of runs through us as ideas that then emerge. I mean, I think of the movement of people across places like never before. I mean, when you speak of communication, at no other moment of human history have we had such a closely, you know, communication being so easy. I mean, you have cables running underwater that really connect us, as you know, the fiber optic cables that connect the world today, and yet we still seem to be living in a world where these communication lines seem to fail us because we don't seem to understand each other. And memory, of course, is something that, you know, it really, each of us hold on to. I was speaking of how each of us have our own versions of the same narrative, or the same experience, where no two people really see anything alike. And why would I subject my art through something where I impose my own, you know, my own story necessarily? I just feel that a lot of people can really enrich it through their own, through what they bring. And in fact, that's something that has happened several times in my own work, and that has really sort of given me new directions in my own practice. When you know, when I took a sculpture to Korea, for instance, for a project that I was doing outdoors, and it was to do with salt. I mean, actually, it was not to do with salt. It was to be made, it was a sculpture in the natural environment, and a text that was to be grown in the ground. But due to some change of weather, we had to move the sculpture in. And what was interesting is that the sculpture itself was to carry this text on the ground that said, was a quotation from Marcel Proust that said, "A change of weather is sufficient to recreate the world and ourselves." And when it got moved in, I just felt that it completely lost meaning, because it was downscaled, and its own relationship with the natural environment was gone. So I did want to take some element out into nature, and I decided to make the text in salt as an essential component, again, of something that you know, of also one that extends life as a medium. Anyhow, so I took salt, the text, out at various places, and people sort of could walk over it and the salt would dissipate. But to me, I was constantly thinking about what it would mean to them in Korea, because of all the connotations of salt and Buddhist practice, and to ward off evil, or in, you know, in Christianity for purity, permanence, and so on. And when I went there, they constantly thought of me having come from India and my relationship to salt as Gandhi's usage of salt to literally bring down an empire, the pinch of salt. And I found that so interesting, and it really changed the way I thought about these salt texts, that I then began to take back to the sea, as salt having come from the sea and kind of returned to the sea. So yeah, I mean, just one of the examples of how others can really enrich the work. And yeah, I don't necessarily think that I would want people to only carry the artist's intention as being the final way that the work should be viewed.
Yeah, it's incredible how many other triggers and thoughts, you know, it can open. And, you know, I'm so intrigued by, you know, what people have even been thinking over the course of this exchange, right? Because, there's, you know, yourself who's speaking over from India, but we've got people from the US, Switzerland, the UK, not to mention also Colombia on this call. So, you know, there's quite a range. And yeah, I think it's beautiful. And I just want to just really, really, really thank you for your time this evening. And I know for you, it's very late at night. So, you know, thank you so much. That's one of the other things, you know, despite increased communication and all of us being able to be here via Zoom, you know, it doesn't detach from the fact that we all have different time zones and different parts of the world, you know, to adhere to, right? So there's
nationalities and temporalities.
And everything is an exchange and a learning process. But also I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And, you know, our door or our inbox is always open. So don't hesitate to message us and be in touch. And, you know, a massive thank you, you know, Reena and Cleo, for, you know, the incredible energy between you two and, you know, the beautiful discussions that you're creating. I think that, you know, I started off this session by saying, like, what an incredibly heavy day today is. Like, it's a really heavy day. But I think moments like this, I mean, at least for me personally, nurture my soul. So thank you. Thank you both. And you know, if I were in Paris, I would be the first to go see your Musée Guimet show. You know, so excited about that. And, you know, all the best for the launch of your online show with Nature Morte on Saturday. We are all sending you warmth and excitement.
Thank you.
And that, just to hone in, that will just be on their website, won't it?
Yes.
The show.
Right.
So anyone, anywhere can access it.
Okay.
And I would urge you to.
Yeah. Great.
Thank
you.
You and thank you, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Reena. Bye. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jenny.
It was amazing. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.